Hello and welcome to SunZia Southwest Transmission Project. Our webinar today is with SunZia and Pattern Development in partnership with InfoCast Events. Today I have with me Tom Ray, Project Manager at SunZia, David Getz, General Manager at SunZia, and Adam Chernia-Clark, Environmental Natural Resources Manager at Pattern Development. Before we get started on the webinar, InfoCast would like to take the moment to speak about our upcoming Transmission West Summit. At our Transmission West Summit, you can network with leading policymakers and transmission executives, and we have people from CAISO, Arizona Corp, and of course SunZia and SunZia as well. So to learn more about the event, please go to www.infocastinc.com/trans-west to learn more about Transmission West. Again, it's www.infocastinc.com/trans-west. And lastly, if you have any questions, we'll be taking questions during our webinar, so please type your questions in the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and we will answer questions if time permits. Thank you so much, and now I'd like to welcome Tom Ray and David Getz from SunZia.
Thank you, Catherine. This is David Getz from SouthWestern Power. Tom and I are delighted to be able to try and give you an introduction to the SunZia Southwest Transmission Project. We're going to take about the next 20 minutes to cover the details of SunZia, and then we're going to hand it over to our business partner, Adam Chernia-Clark at Pattern, to cover the associated wind generation that is planned to tie up with our first line. You can see our project summary here intends to cover the highlights of what for Tom and I has been approximately a 12-year journey through the development of this project to today. If you're not familiar, you can see the highlights. SunZia is effectively a 520-mile independent transmission project that runs from the middle of New Mexico to the middle of Arizona. The commercial basis for our project was always that we knew there was a high-quality wind resource in the middle of New Mexico that lacks transmission capacity. It was in essence stranded, and that was always our driving force for this project. Adam's going to talk at length about that wind resource, the renewables in New Mexico, and Pattern's plans for 1,500 megawatts or more of wind generation when we come to Adam. We did select Pattern Energy as our anchor tenant for our first 500 kV transmission line. We did that last year pursuant to our FERC order of May 2011. We have actually permitted two single circuit 500 kV alternating current lines, and those lines have a transfer capacity rating of 3,000 megawatts. That's from east to west. We went through a three-phase rating process with the Western Electricity Coordinating Council initially in 2011, and then we reconfirmed that rating. So our first line as an AC line will have a transfer capacity of approximately 1,500 megawatts. There's a lot of activity that's we've achieved so far in the permitting area. Tom will cover those details. The end result of our 7-year NEPA action was a record of decision, which we obtained in February of 2015, and that led to this right-of-way grant agreement, which we signed last year. The overall timetable at the moment for SunZia for our first line is we're targeting construction that will begin in the middle of 2018 and with commercial operation by the end of 2020. Next slide, please. I'm going to let Tom take over from here and run through some of the first probably 8 years of SunZia's development.
Thanks, David. The concept for the development of the SunZia project actually originated in regional planning forums in the desert Southwest, primarily led by the Southwest Area Sub-Regional Transmission Planning Group, in meetings that took place in 2006 under something at the time called the ZIA project. And it recognized that across Path 47 in the southern part of Arizona and New Mexico, there was a need for additional transmission transfer capacity, primarily from the eastern end of that path back to the west towards the Palo Verde hub. Seizing on that, we went through a solicitation of partners and so assembled a partner group to develop the project in April 2008 and entered into a memorandum of agreement to do that. And as you can see on the slide there, as we go into the next box of tasks, those of you who are familiar with NEPA, you can see the steps that one goes through at a very high level. The Bureau of Land Management was the lead federal agency and undertook the project following a right-of-way application that was filed in September 2008. Announced an intent to conduct an environmental impact statement in early spring of 2009, from which a draft and then a final EIS emerged by June 2013 with a record of decision that David referenced that was executed and made available by the BLM January 23rd, 2015. The next set of steps here have to do with state permitting. And in Arizona, there's something called a Certificate of Environmental Compatibility, which is essentially a line siting permit that is the subject of hearings by the Arizona Power Plant and Transmission Line Siting Committee, and then confirmed by the meeting of the Arizona Corporation Commission. We went through that process, which itself included almost 15 days of hearings, and emerged with a CEC permit in February of 2016. We will be filing for a similar siting permit under New Mexico statutes, something called a location control permit, here within the next several weeks, and expect to receive that permit from the Public Regulation Commission in New Mexico in the first quarter of next year. The final activities here on this development timetable, final design engineering, that's sort of underway now, will be concluded by the end of the first quarter of 2018. With financial close by the second quarter, EPC activity and construction allowing for commercial operation, as David pointed out, by 2020. Next slide. This is a slide that depicts the study area for SunZia. The state boundary between Arizona on your left and New Mexico on the right is down the middle of the slide. And the boundary of this large blob is the study area in which NEPA was conducted by the Bureau of Land Management in cooperation with 14 state and federal cooperating agencies. It was a very large EIS effort. And what you're seeing there are alternative routes that were subject to the analysis by the BLM in both states, which easily exceeded 2,000 miles of alternatives. The point of this slide is that for linear projects, we all start out with an application for a preferred alignment, but NEPA is all about looking at alternatives to what's preferred, and this is just a map that depicts that, I think, rather in a stark way. Next slide. The BLM selected route in the record of decisions depicted on this slide, again, within a narrow study area. And you can see it originates at SunZia East substation in New Mexico, which is the collector endpoint substation for the wind energy development that Adam will speak about when he comes up on this webinar. It's about 519 miles, linear miles across its alignment, and every land jurisdiction is crossed with the exception of Indian lands, BLM State Trust, various other forms of land, Bureau of Reclamation, and so forth. I want to point out on this map, though, the little 3 red squares up north of the White Sands Missile Range. Those are mitigation segments that result of agreements that we entered into with the Department of Defense to preserve low-level testing capabilities for White Sands Missile Range. And those 3 areas are areas of undergrounding that will take place. The little box, red box on the left is 1 mile. And then the center box, red box, and the easternmost red box are each 2 miles. So there's 5 miles of 500 kV solid dielectric cable and transition stations involved in that area of the route to preserve low-level altitude testing capability at White Sands Missile Range. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, we started our permitting with the submission of the right-of-way application with the BLM in September of 2008. completed NEPA with the ROD in January of 2015. Spent about a year and a quarter entering into agreements with Army and Department of Defense that resulted in the underground segments that I pointed out in the previous slide, and some other provisions that were set forth in an MOA that we entered into with the Army and Department of Defense. Completed the state line permitting in Arizona and are left with our permits in New Mexico and a Section 404 permit with Corps, which we believe will be on a nationwide permit basis. Next slide. I want to speak a little bit about something called a plan of development. Those of you on the webinar who have had experience in working through a big EIS know what a POD is. This is a rather detailed design of roads, access roads, lay down yards, pulling intentional locations, structure sites themselves, of course, along the entire route. And it's really the construction blueprint for the EPC contractor that's integrated with environmental resource mitigation provisions that are set forth in various permits, in the record of decision, in the right-of-way grant itself with the BLM, and with other landowner commitments in both states, primarily focusing on biological habitat and species preservations, paleo resources, historic and cultural sites under Section 106 of the National Cultural Historic Preservation Act. All of that mitigation is embodied along with the construction details in the POD that's subject to review by 5 field offices in the 2 states that BLM has involved in the project. And we hope to issue the final POD to the BLM for their review and approval by September, and with a notice to proceed to construct on the federal property by the first quarter of 2018 following their approval of the final POD. Now I'll hand it back to David on the next slide to talk a little bit about engineering and construction.
Thanks, Tom. What Tom, I think, explained very briefly is that what we've discovered here with SunZia is there's an intimate interaction in our development of the POD between engineering and construction, particularly design engineering, environmental issues, and right-of-way. And I'm going to speak to this just a little bit here over the next few slides. We engaged Burns & McDonnell as the engineer of record for SunZia last year, about a little over a year ago. And Burns & Mac has been very busy working on the design of SunZia to facilitate the start of construction and our target for the middle of next year. We recently engaged Power Engineers as the owner's engineer to help us as the owner group monitor the work of Burns & McDonnell and our nominated contractor. And you can see we picked a EPC contract approach for SunZia, and the EPC contractor we've nominated is a joint venture of Kiewit Power and our parent company, MMR Group. Burns & Mac is, we hit 30% design complete earlier this year, and that was the basis for enabling us to go out and start talking with suppliers and vendors for some of the work that will be done underneath the EPC contractor. That design work is continuing today, and we hope to achieve a 70% design level here by the end of September or early October. We're currently in discussion with a number of parties who will be providing materials and construction services for this project under the EPC contractor. And so we've split the project itself up into 4 segments. Those were shown on one of the previous maps, but each segment is approximately 100 to 125 miles long. And the reason for that was just to facilitate some parallel construction. We aren't exactly sure yet how many subcontractors for the construction of the project there will be, but it's likely to be more than one, but those discussions are ongoing. Lastly, I'll say that we anticipate a construction duration of 30 months, and in practice what that will mean for us is that we're going to need to target energization of the line somewhere in the middle of 2020 to allow enough time for the interplay with the proposed wind farms that Pattern's working on to get fully energized and tested and commissioned. Next slide, please. In terms of the rights-of-way, we have 5 primary categories of rights-of-way, and we've been working actively on all of them for some time. The federal right-of-way, Tom mentioned, we've actually entered into a right-of-way grant with the BLM, so that sort of lease agreement is locked in, and we've been making payments since last year. That covers 180 miles of the 519. In Arizona and New Mexico, there is state trust lands that are held in trust by the state for the benefit of public education. In Arizona, we've submitted an application to the Arizona State Land Department last year, and that will cover approximately 134 miles of state trust land in Arizona. In New Mexico, we are working on submitting on the application to submit to the New Mexico State Land Office. There are 96 miles in New Mexico. The processes in the 2 states are slightly different. In Arizona, you apply first and then do a lot of the preparation work, whereas in New Mexico, the statutes and the regulations require you to do a lot of the work in advance and then submit an application. That's why we're hoping to submit our application to New Mexico State Land in the next month or 2. Turning to private right-of-way, we have 16 miles of private right-of-way in Arizona, and there's something like 40 or so private landowners. We have started that work earlier this year and are in active negotiation acquiring that right-of-way. In New Mexico, we have a significantly more private right-of-way, 93 miles. Again, probably something like slightly over 100 private landowners we're talking to. And that acquisition process started earlier this year, and we're in discussion and acquiring that right-of-way as we speak. Next slide, please. You know, at the end of the day, this is an independent transmission project which will be supported by transmission service agreements between ourselves and Pattern's wind farms that they're developing and will build adjacent to SunZia East. The ultimate credit support for the transmission service agreements with our customer, Pattern Energy, and their wind farms, of course, will be power purchase agreements that Pattern is working on with end-use customers who are interested in high-quality New Mexico wind energy. We started this process off years ago with a company called First Wind, and that was our initial anchor tenant. They were selected in August 2013 pursuant to our FERC order. Many of you may know that First Wind was acquired by SunEdison, and unfortunately SunEdison went bankrupt, which led us to go out to market again, go through another anchor tenant process, which we conducted last year. That second anchor tenant process resulted in the selection of Pattern Energy about a year ago, August 2016, as the new anchor tenant for up to 50% of our capacity, i.e. half of what we have available, and that's stipulated in our FERC order. That led to that therefore was the award of 1,500 megawatts of our capacity to Pattern Energy, essentially the capacity of line 1. Pattern has been actively working on marketing New Mexico wind energy for the past half a year or so, and those activities are going well. There is significant interest from end-use customers in this wind energy because it's very high capacity factor wind energy, approaching 50%. And we're very optimistic at this point that we'll have all the contracts we need to enable financing of this project by next year. Next slide, please. This gives you just a few highlights of our schedule at this point. We've covered some of those historical events that have happened. Engineering is the first not yet completed milestone, and that's for LNTP is limited notice to proceed, and that means we anticipate kicking off some of the engineering and construction activities end of third quarter, early fourth quarter, and that's really to get a jump start on the long lead items that are required for the project. Tom mentioned our New Mexico State permit, which we expect to submit very soon, and we've allowed 5 to 6 months for that process to conclude, and we're very optimistic about getting that permit in the first quarter of 2018. We have significant support at the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, and we've had several meetings with staff in anticipation of that submission. The rights of way, I've covered. That's a complicated area. All those, the state and private rights of way are in parallel right now, and we expect to complete them hopefully early next year by the end of first quarter. And that would lead, as I said, to this start of construction and then project COD. At this point, Tom and I will cover some of the major challenges that we've experienced in the last 10 to 12 years of development. So I'll let Tom go first and ask for next slide, please.
Thanks, David. It comes as no surprise to many of you that are dialed into this webinar that interstate transmission lines are just very difficult, like any long linear facility, be it pipe or overhead power lines. But transmission is particularly difficult because although it is affected with interstate commerce, its siting process is decided at both federal and state levels through a complicated maze of procedures that it turns into almost a full employment act for attorneys that practice in this area. I wanted to point out a couple of things that you confront because of the long permitting periods that you're confronted with as a developer, whether you're an independent developer or a utility trying to build these longer lines. And it turns out that a decade, in SunZia's case, from the time we filed our right-of-way application until we will have completed our final state permit is 10 years. And a lot can happen in 10 years. We, in our case, went through a recession. It affected power demand. There's certainly changes by the PUCs and renewable energy policies that affect the market, particularly coming out of California, which is a very large economic driver in the West, as we all know. Changing policies on national environmental issues that comes with changes in administration, changes in Congress, and we've certainly seen that over this period of time. And that elections have consequences, therefore we have key decision-making employees in the federal agencies and military agencies that may be on board with your project, but they leave and the person coming in has to be re-educated, and that retards development. And finally, there can always be unexpected military conflicts, not just those that arise when you're proposing an alternative alignment on military-owned land, but on public land proximate to military operation or areas that are used for military training routes or siting conflicts that may develop, particularly for use of the airspace above public land. And we certainly had our share of that. And David will offer on the next slide some additional thoughts regarding some of these challenges.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, really, we're just about here at the end of our SunZia presentation, and I just wanted to highlight sort of 4 additional items. And as you can tell, Tom and I are colleagues, almost partners in this, but we've focused on slightly different areas. And I've been much more involved in the financial and commercial matters, whereas Tom has been absolutely engaged in the licensing and permitting and electrical rating aspects of our project. So, you know, my points here are that it's really impossible to anticipate all the development issues that you'll discover on this lengthy journey we've been on, and that's certainly been our experience. And as a consequence, it's almost impossible to forecast, you know, what a development, independent transmission project is going to cost you to develop. And we've certainly blown through our own budgets several times as we discovered new events and new issues, particularly in the environmental permitting arena. Therefore, you know, the amounts of development capital that are required to succeed are extremely large, and that's a huge challenge, particularly for small developers. I think anybody who is a project developer knows that development capital is the hardest type of capital to raise and the most expensive. We've been very fortunate here at SouthWestern Power that our parent company, MMR Group, has funded the large majority of this development, and consequently, we are the majority owner of the project. Tom talked about NEPA, and you know, we've got this issue, construction cannot commence until the POD is approved. We haven't dwelled on it, but approval of the POD in our case has resulted in we have to almost essentially have final engineering and all right-of-way in hand and full environmental surveys on 100% of the project. before we will get permission from the BLM to commence construction. That is, again, another quite a high bar or a high hurdle for a development project to overcome before you know that you can commence construction. And lastly, I want to mention the staying power issue, which that we've seen that in the 10 or 12 years that we've been working on this project. Our company's been in business here about 15, 16 years, but you know, it does take stubbornness, some would call it, others might call it a vision, but whatever you want to call it, it takes significant staying power, and that is, again, not an easy thing for the private sector independent developers to sustain. So all of that leads to the fact that there are not very many. There are a handful of large independent transmission projects in the West, and we're pleased to say SunZia is one of those. We have been able to stay the course, and we're highly confident that we will be starting construction next year. I'm just finally going to say, I'm not going to say much about them, but if you, Catherine, can flip to the slide after the next. We've included just some brief details here on SouthWestern Power Group. I won't read through this, but you can see we are a relatively small group of approximately 8 to 10 development professionals here at our company, and we've been working together, all of us, for most of that time. We are, next slide, please. We are owned by a large construction services firm, MMR Group. They're not necessarily a household name. They do happen to be one of the U.S.'s largest electrical contractors, privately owned and in business for over 25 years. And again, as a privately held company with our senior management being the active shareholders, we do have the luxury of having a very consistent and supportive parent company that's been willing to provide the resources necessary over the time frame. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Adam Chernia-Clark. Adam is going to cover the associated generation and the renewable energy aspects. Adam is the Environmental and Natural Resources Manager for Pattern Development. Adam, over to you.
Great, thanks, David. So I will try, next slide. I'll try to be real quick and company overview so we have time for questions. But Pattern Development is a US-based renewable energy, so wind, solar transmission company, and we've got a global footprint. We've got a lot of projects coming up in Canada, got a lot of projects in the US, and we're working also in Japan, Chile, and Mexico as well. And we've developed, financed, and placed in operations over 4,500 megawatts of wind, and we've got a pipeline, development pipeline of close to 6 gigawatts of renewables, and are also currently developing a 400-mile HVDC line that would bring Texas wind into the southeast. And we also just brought online our Broadview wind project in New Mexico, which is 324 megawatts that's marketed to California, and had a really good experience with that, and had been looking for some good opportunities to continue to bring high quality wind into the California market. I'll talk about the California market right now. Next slide. And following. So I wanted to explain the situation in California. Some of y'all might be familiar with what people are calling the duck curve, but essentially California has had such a rapid deployment of solar energy that it's started to have serious impacts on the entire demand curve, to the point where I believe they're actually curtailing solar because there's just too much going into the system at certain times of day. And what this means is that California, they want to keep meeting their renewable goals, and they are now 2030 is looming on us with a big demand, and wind can help level that curve. So that's why we wanted to find opportunities to bring a bunch of wind power from high quality resources out of state into the California market. Next slide. And here's a map of the 80-meter average wind speeds in the US. And as you can see, what we have is one of the best resources for wind. It's very far away, but as close to California as you can really get. And SunZia obviously identified this resource, and we were eager to do more wind in New Mexico. And that's kind of how we came upon this partnership. Next slide. And I wanted to explain a little bit of the interaction between the federal production tax credit and the market opportunities that are represented by off-takers in California contracting power now for later delivery. The federal production tax credit for wind is currently phasing out. So each year, activities initiated qualify for 100, 80%, 60%, and so on. And you can see from this chart just how valuable it is contracting power now for later is, because that power can get, assuming it comes online, so we're going to get 100% PTCs for these projects with a 2020 horizon. And what that means is that off-takers can enjoy the benefits of a $23 federal production tax credit, really giving them a market advantage. So that's kind of how the California market has a big role for out-of-state wind. In-state wind, there's not a lot of good resource, and the permitting timelines for wind facilities in California just do not accommodate taking advantage of these production tax credits. Next slide. Yeah, so now I want to talk a little bit about our Corona wind projects. These are the projects that we're developing as anchor tenants for SunZia. Next slide. So here's the area where we are, and again, it's really high quality wind, and it will go to the Palo Verde hub, and that will then go to CAISO. Next slide. And so we are in Guadalupe, Lincoln, and Torrance counties, and right now we have a 250,000 acres under option. That's a lot of land, but by spacing out the turbines, we avoid wake effects, which lead to energy production losses. At the end of last year, we qualified about 900 megawatts worth of federal production tax credits through pre-construction activities. There's two ways to qualify for production tax credits. You can either do pre-construction activities, or you can do equipment purchases. So here we'll do a combination of those two across different project companies. And this is going to be about 1,500 megawatts. It'll probably end up being more than that. And as I said, it's a mix of construction, qualification, and equipment purchases. Next slide. And here's my wheelhouse. So permitting wind is an extremely complicated process, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came out several years ago with the land-based wind energy guidelines, and these have really become standard practice, especially among larger utility-scale wind companies, to really minimize risk and try to maximize the extent to which the agencies will exert prosecutorial discretion, because, for example, there's no way to avoid the fact that wind turbines will lead to bird mortality, for example. And so this process really starts with trying to understand what are the pre-existing conditions, and how can you adapt your development process to really minimize impacts. Next slide. And here I just want to go over a lot of the work that we do on all of our projects. So as I said, we'll do a critical issues analysis for all our projects and initiate avian use surveys. So this is literally having biologists walking around counting birds. We're in the midst of our first year of avian use surveys for the Corona projects. And when there are eagles, we'll tend to do raptor nest surveys. So again, this is a biologist having identified raptor nests, really monitoring the use and where the eagles go, and that sort of stuff, so that we can microsite to really minimize impacts there. And then there's geotechnical surveys. We had a fun surprise here to discover that the entire well, not the entire, a large portion of the area is riddled with essentially Swiss cheese with karst formations. So trying to get our hands on that has been fun. And then cultural resource surveys. So we do these on private and public land. Typically, there's not a jurisdictional hook on private land, but it's the best management practice that we follow, and it really ends up simplifying things, even if there's some upfront development capital spend. And then a big part, it's a little bit easier to deal with in the West, is wetlands, which are federally jurisdictional and administered by the Army Corps of Engineers. And when you're on private land, typically this is the area where you can sort of get what's called a federal nexus under NEPA, which Tom and David mentioned earlier. So we really try to just avoid impacts to resources to the maximum extent practical wherever we can. So all of this is an iterative process, and when you start layering constraints upon constraints upon constraints, suddenly 250,000 acres is quite a bit less when you're trying to place 1,500 megawatts or more. So it's complicated, and we have some military issues here. New Mexico is basically a giant military flight path, so trying to interface with the Air Force bases and make sure that there's not operational impacts to them is just another layer of siting complexity. Next slide. Yep, that's about it. So Corona's actually been complicated in some ways, but pretty manageable. The most challenging thing, I think, is just really having a limited development timeline due to the fact that we are financing jointly with SunZia. So we're rushing to do some of these things like the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, location approval, county ordinance sort of compliance. So there's a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. But that is a quick overview of our development and siting process.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, and thank you to Tom and David for your presentations. Now, if you have any questions, we'll open the floor for any questions that you may have concerning the SunZia projects or pattern development. Let me just take a look. I have a question here from Bob, and he's asking, how does wind help an overgeneration situation? So whoever can answer that can just step in.
I can hop in real quick. So wind has a different generation profile than solar. So what it does is it smooths out the generation profile for renewables. I don't know, Tom or David, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, Adam, yeah, that's right. I think it's the time of occurrence more than. That's very important. It turns out that the wind resource in New Mexico, that pattern is developing, apart from having consistently high capacity factors, it tends to increase at a time in availability and therefore energy availability. It increases its occurrence and availability to generate about the same time that a great deal of solar along the Colorado River and in California and even in Arizona is beginning to decline in production from its production curve. So it's complementary such that as the investment that utilities have made and utility scale solar facilities are complemented by the occurrence of wind energy delivered from that resource because it's being made available from a completely different geographic location and provides both geographic diversity and replacement opportunity using an energy resource that has no emissions and no cost of fuel.
All right, thank you so much for answering that. Bob also asks, what percent of the right-of-way do you have easements contracted at this time?
This is David Getz. We aren't going to give the exact numbers, but we are well on our way. We're well over 50% contracted in Arizona at this point, and that process, frankly, that started a little earlier than the New Mexico fee right-of-way. I'm talking about private right-of-way in Arizona. With regard to the state trust lands in Arizona, of course, that's kind of an all or nothing aspect, and we're in the process of having that right-of-way application processed and approved by the Arizona State Land Department. And I think we anticipate closing out that activity early next year with ASLD. In New Mexico, we have more right-of-way. There are more private landowners to deal with. It's a much bigger task, and we are not yet at that 50% level. And I would say today we're probably around a quarter, 20 to 25% contracted. But we have a lot of effort, boots on the ground, working on that as we speak. Private right-of-way, we knew from the beginning, was always going to be the most challenging and frankly the most expensive. So we are in that process, and again, I'd say as a developer, you plan as much as you can, and then you have to anticipate the reality and figure out how to work with all those private landowners to reach commercial agreements on a equitable and fair basis. Again, and the final thing I'd say in New Mexico with regard to the state land office, again, that's an all or nothing thing, and that we'll be submitting our application here soon. We anticipate that. We've been working with the New Mexico State Land Office for well over a year, if not a year and a half. But again, that right-of-way application or lease, we hope will be finished probably in the second quarter, I would imagine, of next year. Again, timing is yet to be finally determined, only because the agency doesn't even have our application yet. So, again, we're at this stage, we're well along, and I think by the end of this year, we certainly hope to have most of our private right-of-way fully under contract, fully finished, and we'll be working through the state processes at that point, hopefully to round out private rights-of-way. Catherine, the one thing I'd add, and we didn't put it on the slide, just so the audience is aware, that in addition to the sort of 5 categories that we listed of private rights-of-way, we have probably 90 aerial crossings where SunZia will cross over or under, depending on the situation. And other transmission lines, generally we're going over, but there are a few instances we'll go under. We also have to cross natural gas pipelines, canals, interstate highways, the Rio Grande River. All those sort of typically other linear features usually require an additional permit or permission from the owner. So that process, again, is well underway, and we are working through those aerial crossings, and that we consider that part of our right-of-way approach, because before we can start construction, we'll certainly have to satisfy the construction financing parties, the construction lenders, that we have all the necessary licenses, permits, and key rights-of-way in hand.
All right, thank you. Oh, sorry.
Just add one point to what David said. It's between the 2 state land departments in Arizona and New Mexico, that's about 230 miles of the 319 miles of the alignment. And given the downturn in oil prices, the majority of the revenues for the trust in New Mexico has been coming from the oil and gas sector in the southeastern part of the state. That's fallen off precipitously. The benefits that are harvested by both state land departments go to the schools, public schools. So there is a positive bias from a fiduciary standpoint to enter into lease agreements so that there's more money coming into the trust. It is a matter, though, as David pointed out, of processing the application. We feel confident about that.
Oh, thank you guys both so much for your answers. I just have a question here from Jill. She was wondering, who will be the off-takers of the wind generation delivered via SunZia?
So that's still underway, and that's not my area of expertise, but that's I couldn't really say at this point.
All right, thank you.
Catherine, can I add to what Adam contributed there, just because we're working very closely with Pattern, although Pattern obviously is the generator and they are leading the power marketing effort. We've been working with them because the transmission, SunZia as a project is part of the, call it, story. And we have talked to almost all of the utilities in Arizona and California, and a few parties in Nevada, but there are a host of typically electric utilities, There are some non-electric utility folks that are potential customers. There are a number of large corporates that have a serious interest to buy 100% renewables or supply their facilities with 100% renewables. And finally, there are some new kind of entrants in the California market called community choice aggregators, abbreviated CCAs now, and they, all those entities are very interested in filling up their long-term procurement needs with renewable energy. So Pattern has a very sophisticated, very large power marketing effort underway, and while we can't identify today, and it is confidential, but we have significant interest from, you know, those host of potential customers, and hence our confidence that we are going to have sufficient PPAs for Pattern's wind farms, which will support the financing of SunZia.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. I just have a quick question here from Earl. He was just wondering, do you have any contact information for transmission line subcontractors to submit their qualifications?
This is David Getz again. We do, and Catherine, I think rather than pull it out of memory, I mean, the primary contact for that is Kiewit Power, which is leading the EPC effort. And if Earl would contact you, Catherine, we can certainly provide that information, you know, to the parties. For the moment, I'd say that's probably the best thing to do. We appreciate the interest of all potential suppliers or subcontractors, vendors. That process has already begun. It's well underway, but again, there is significant opportunity, and particularly I'd say for a lot of the materials that will be bought locally in Arizona and New Mexico, we are promoting local procurement wherever possible. Naturally, for some of the construction of this project, it's highly specialized, and a project that's as large as SunZia is, it's over $1 billion of capital investment. You know, we will be looking to very, very well experienced and major players in the construction of overhead electric lines. So I will provide get that contact information to you, Catherine, and so that you can have it. I just don't have it the name of the individual and their email address. I'll need to go reference that.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think we'll just end on that note. I just want to say thanks again to everyone for this webinar. Thank you, Tom, David, and Adam, and everyone who tuned in, and for all of your excellent questions. As a reminder, you will receive an email with a recording of this webinar within 24 hours, and make sure to sign up for InfoCast's 9th Annual Transmission Summit West. And actually, if you've been following along, David Getz from SunZia will be there as a panelist, and he'll be available for any one-on-one meetings at our summit. So if you'd like to learn more about SunZia projects, you can go say hello to David there. And that's all we have for today. So thanks again, and hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time.